This MMA30 segment is powered by The Gun Store. Next time you're in Las Vegas, if you want to shoot a real machine gun, do it at The Gun Store at 2900 East Tropicana. To start the show today, let's talk about UFC 137. Happened 1 week ago here in Las Vegas. Let's play matchmaker because a lot of interesting outcomes on this card, a lot of retirements from legendary guys, and what's going to be next for some of the biggest names in the sport have really developed off of UFC 137. Mirko Cro Cop and Roy Nelson. Roy Nelson goes out there and does a nice job, just beats up Mirko Cro Cop, never really appeared to be in danger, overwhelmed him really wherever the fight went, and easily won it, got a TKO there in the third round about a minute and a half in. Mirko Cro Cop decides to call it a night, but what do you do next with Roy Nelson? Of course, if you ask Roy Nelson, I'll tell you exactly what he thinks next. Have you heard his next Nostradamus prediction?
No.
Okay, so Roy Nelson a while ago, I was doing an interview with him, and he mentioned that he didn't think that Brock Lesnar would ever fight in the UFC again. He said, look, what's going to happen is Brock Lesnar has agreed to do The Ultimate Fighter on Spike TV because they think it'll bring huge numbers, and that's kind of his pass out. That's his, I want to get out of the UFC, and that was his farewell, his swan song or whatever with Dana White. And at first I was like, well, obviously that's not true because he's got another fight booked. He's going to fight Junior Dos Santos at UFC 131 up in Vancouver. Well, it turns out he doesn't actually make that fight. And Shane Carwin steps up and takes the Junior Dos Santos fight. And so Brock Lesnar, we do know that he's been sick again, and so he takes some time off there and he's going to recuperate. But what Roy Nelson has said is that the fight with Brock Lesnar and Alistair Overeem isn't actually going to happen. Instead, Frank Mir is going to be promoted up to UFC 141 in the main event, and he's going to take on Alistair Overeem here in Las Vegas on December 30th. And he said, Roy Nelson said that he predicts he'll actually get put in against Big Nog at UFC 140 in Toronto on December 10th. So Roy Nelson, again, with another one of these predictions that his first one, while it seemed far-fetched and it seems in some ways incorrect, to this point is still true. His prediction was Brock Lesnar isn't going to fight again. Brock Lesnar still hasn't fought, and that fight with Junior Dos Santos and Brock Lesnar specifically wasn't going to happen because he found it to be a little bit too fishy that Shane Carwin was fighting what many people consider to be a no-name on that card. So we'll see. But Roy Nelson, it's interesting. His predictions, I like him.
What he's really saying is he wants to fight Big Nog. Thinks that's a good fight for him.
Do you think that's a good fight for him?
Big Nog?
Yeah.
I do. The performance against Brendan Schaub, what a lot of people forget when they look at Brendan Schaub's record, and I think Brendan is going to be a very good fighter, and I think he's a good fighter now. He's not a great fighter. And I think he had some holes in his game, and if you looked at the fight with Cro Cop, yes, if you just looked at the highlight in the third round when he knocked Cro Cop out, you go, wow, great, knockout of the night. On paper, it all looks good. When you watch the fight and dissect the fight, Cro Cop, Brendan's the only guy that made Cro Cop look good in the last 3 or 4 fights that he's had. Cro Cop was hitting him repeatedly. I think he busted up his nose, and he was holding his own, to say the least. And lately, that's not something Cro Cop has been doing. So I don't put a huge amount of stock in the win over Brendan. That, to me, does not mean that Big Nog is the Big Nog who is dominating Pride. I picked Nog to win that fight. I thought the odds were kind of crazy, but, it is what it is. I think that Roy is a much better fighter than people give him credit for. Why? Because of what he looks like, right? He's got great grappling. He's not going to out-grapple Nogueira, but he's got that big right hand. And I just think that sooner or later it will find a home, and he will wear Nog down. And I think Nog is slowing down a bit. I think you can see that. I think certainly the surgeries helped him in the fight with Schaub. But I think Nelson's at another level from Schaub. And, Roy knocked him out in the tough finale, so there's evidence for that. I think it is a good fight for Roy, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think that Lesnar is going to fight Overeem, and Mir is going to fight Nog, and Roy is going to shake out somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and maybe that's just a jockeying for position sort of thing. I don't think that Roy Nelson really has a crystal ball, but it would be amazing if it happened. And actually, I kind of like the fight of Frank Mir and Alistair Overeem quite a bit. Not that I like Brock Lesnar and Alistair Overeem even more because Brock's an exciting guy and I love watching him fight, but I do like that fight quite a bit. And actually, I like Roy Nelson and Big Nog more than I like a rematch of Frank Mir and Big Nog. All right, moving along, Chet Congo and Matt Mitrione. Where does Chet Congo sit in the division now? Would you like to see maybe a Chet Congo Roy Nelson fight? Would that be interesting to you?
Yeah, actually, it would be interesting to me. And it's funny to me because, I've spoken, I had Sergio Nan on my show after the fight, and he said that, at USA Today, they had Congo 13th in the heavyweight division.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, who's the 12 guys in front of him? Like, I know 5 guys that belong in front of him, but and listen, I think Congo has flaws in his game, no doubt about it. I still don't think his takedown defense is there. I think his striking looked to be more aggressive and better early on in his MMA career. He has definitely offensively improved his wrestling and his ground and pound, but really, like in the UFC, there's more than 6 guys that are in front of him. I think he's in that second tier. I think you have like those top 5, and then when you go 6 to 10, I think Congo's in that conversation, and I think that's where Roy Nelson is. Yeah. So I think that's a great fight. I mean, you get into all sorts of things of Congo's athleticism and his striking versus Roy's ability to get him to the ground, because on the feet, you would have to think that Congo would have a decided advantage.
Almost
with Roy,
certainly, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you put it that way. I mean, Congo is, in many ways, the perfect gatekeeper, because I don't think that he'll ever go in there and beat guys like Junior Dos Santos or Cain Velasquez, unless something dramatic were to happen. But I do think that he is the perfect guy to test guys that are on their way up, like Travis Brown, to see whether or not they can cut it, or Matt Mitrione. And he is that individual that stands in the way of that elite upper echelon of the heavyweight division. So what will happen next with Chet Congo, we have to wait and see. But I agree. I think a Roy Nelson and Chet Congo fight would be a lot of fun, and
Absolutely.
they can easily sell that because they're so different, too. All right, we're going to take a
They
quick
look
break.
a little different.
Quite a bit, yeah. If you had 2 guys that were from opposite ends of the earth, it would be those 2. So let's talk about this main event at UFC 137. BJ Penn and Nick Diaz. Surprisingly, Nick Diaz was a favorite going into or an underdog going into this one. BJ Penn was the favorite. It seemed pretty clear, at least to a lot of the people that I talked to, that BJ Penn was going to look good in the first round, and then it was going to be all Nick Diaz after that, and that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I felt about it. I was just surprised. I talked to a lot of media at the event, and everybody I talked to picked Penn. And
really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
put him on blast right now.
No, let's not do that. I don't want him to hate me. But listen, we all get fights wrong. We all get fights right. But the interesting thing to me was that when we kind of debated it in the media room, and I said, listen, just point me to one fight where BJ Penn at 170 pounds, okay, not at 155, at 170, has not started to gas in the second round. Like, the fight doesn't exist. And he's now 1-4-1 at 170. And, when he announced his retirement, first of all, I don't think he's going to stay retired. I think it was an emotional thing. But if you listen to what he said, I don't want to go home looking like this, so which is in essence saying I'm not being competitive. Well, I'm a huge BJ Penn fan. Like, I think that he is one of the most talented mixed martial artists. If you take skill set and you put it against everybody else's, he's in the upper echelon of fighters in the history of MMA. When you look at his striking, his Brazilian jiu-jitsu, his takedown defense, the only thing that's ever missing is cardio at 170. So if you're retiring because you don't want to fight anymore, God bless you. If you're retiring because you're not being competitive, you need to be in the weight division that you belong fighting in.
Right.
The record doesn't lie. Since he came back at UFC 58 against George St. Pierre, he is 1-4-1. The one fight was the 21-second knockout of Matt Hughes that he won. In every other fight, except the second St. Pierre fight, he dominates the first round.
Yeah.
So if these fights were one round, unless he's fighting George St. Pierre, I pick BJ Penn against every 170 in the world. But that's like saying you're going to take the Miami Heat, even though there's 4 quarters, because they're always winning after 3. It doesn't work that way. And I think if BJ's back at 155, he's a force. He's right in the mix. I think he's still the fighter that he was before. But at 170, I think what's happened is that modern MMA has progressed so much. The guys have gotten so good. It's gotten so competitive, weight cutting, everything else, that the days of fighting out of your weight class at the upper end of a weight class, really, there's a select few that can do that. And I think we're learning now that as good as BJ's skill set is, as crazy as he is as a technician and everything else, a gassing, phenomenal fighter can lose to fighters who may not be as technically good as him, who are not gassing. And who's he in with? He's in with a guy who does triathlons for fun.
Right.
Probably not the situation you're looking for.
Swim 12 miles just for the hell of it.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, a fight that I would love to see is I would like to see BJ Penn come back, commit himself to 155 pounds, and I'd love to see him fight Gray Maynard.
Yeah, I would love to see him fight Maynard too. Listen, you know who I'd really love to see him fight even more than Maynard? Gilbert Melendez.
Boy, that would be a fun one.
I mean,
that'd be so fun.
And like I had a debate yesterday on another show because they were like, well, I heard that, you thought BJ shouldn't retire and blah, blah. I said, listen, I'm not that guy. Like, it's your legacy,
Yeah.
But when you're a Vanderlei and maybe it looks like you're starting to get hurt in there, yeah, I would say,
right, yeah.
Okay, you got to go. But BJ's not at that point, obviously. But my point was, listen, he can do what he wants, but if he's going to keep fighting, he has to do it in the right weight class. And they're like, yeah, but, is he really going to be competitive? I'm like, are you kidding? Like, if you heard that he was fighting Gilbert Melendez tomorrow, I don't think everybody goes, oh, man, poor BJ.
Right.
I'm going, wow,
That's
I can't
a great
wait
fight.
to see that fight.
And even when BJ and Nick Diaz went to the ground, I mean, it was for a split second, but BJ looked like he had a decided advantage there. I mean, for a moment he had his back, and I mean, Diaz did a great job getting out of it, but I think if they'd spent more time on the ground, BJ would have had a clear advantage.
And that's a guy at 170, right, who's bigger than him,
right,
who's a Gracie black belt, who's known for his jiu-jitsu. I think BJ's that's what's fun to me, to watch in jiu-jitsu. Like when he gets on the ground and he starts rolling with guys, it's like he has 4 arms because the dexterity in his legs is just sick.
And that's why a Gray Maynard fight, a guy that is going to try to wrestle him and take him down and bully him, and same thing with Gilbert Melendez, those are both really exciting fights.
I think they're phenomenal fights. And that's why, look, if BJ were listening and I had any influence with him, I'd say, hey, dude, if in your heart of hearts you just don't want to do this anymore, I'll be the first one to say thank you for the memories. You're phenomenal, and I will, whisk you off into the sunset. But if you're stopping because you're not being competitive, then you owe it to yourself. If it's still in your heart to fight, but you feel like you're not being competitive, then you got to fight in the right weight division.
Right.
And I just don't think he's been doing that.
Well, he always listens to the MMA30 radio hour every week.
Fantastic.
And he says, whatever you guys tell me to do on your radio show, I'm doing.
So we should get the Maynard or Melendez announcement next week.
Yep. In fact, Gray Maynard always listens too. Gray, you up for it? If you're not, just go ahead and call in. But a silence, I'll say that you're accepting the fight on your behalf. What about Nick Diaz? I mean, of course, we know that he's fighting George St. Pierre. He leapfrogs Carlos Condit, which I don't really like. I think that Condit deserves that fight. I think that Condit was ready for the fight. I like that matchup quite a bit. I do like, to be fair, I do like the Nick Diaz and the BJ and the George St. Pierre fight a little bit better. I find that to be a bit more intriguing, but I don't like the fact that poor Carlos Condit kind of gets pushed off onto the shelf, and hopefully he doesn't lose his next fight, because if he does, then his whole career is torched. But
right,
does Nick Diaz, based on what you saw against BJ Penn and over his last several fights over in Strikeforce, have a shot against GSP?
Nope. To me, Condit is actually the bigger threat to GSP because he's a finisher.
Yep.
Right? Here's the thing with Diaz. There's one hole in his game, and we saw it with BJ early in the first round when he took him down. Granted, Nick was able to use a technique to spin out of it and reverse it and everything else, but he still got taken down.
Right.
GSP.
Are you saying GSP has good wrestling?
He's got pretty good wrestling.
Pretty good wrestling, yeah.
And believe it or not, he's got pretty decent cardio, right?
I seem to have noticed that, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the problem for Nick is that the biggest hole in his game actually happens to be the biggest strength in GSP's game,
right.
And that's the takedowns. He's not going to gas. The odds of Nick submitting GSP off his back are crazy, crazy small. They're slim and none, and Slim just left the building, right? So I don't see that happening. And I really believe that this fight is going. If you go back to UFC 100 and you watch the fight between GSP and Thiago Alves, I think it's going to look like a carbon copy. I think that Diaz will try to do something in the first 30 to 45 seconds. And GSP will sniff him out, take him down, and he will be on top of him for the majority of the rest of the round. The other thing that GSP doesn't have to worry about, that he did have to worry about with Alves, is that Diaz doesn't have one-punch knockout power. He just beats you and hits you with volume and 200-300 shots. So, sure, after a while, it hurts and it staggers guys, and we saw what he did to BJ. BJ's never looked like that in his entire career. But GSP's not going to stand there, and he can take 2 or 3 of those shots to take him down. And Diaz has to get close enough to him to hit him, which means he's going to get blasted on a double.
Right.
And I think GSP is just going to have Nate on his back. And I think if it's a stoppage, it'll be because Nate bleeds, that Nick bleeds, because he has a lot of scar tissue over the eyes, and he tends to bleed pretty easily. So with some ground and pound, I could see him getting bloodied up enough. Otherwise, I think it's another 5-round decision for George.
All right. Well, that fight is rumored. It's not confirmed yet, but it's supposedly going to be happening Super Bowl weekend here in Las Vegas, right?
That's what we're hearing. And you know what? Here's where this fight is better than the Condit fight, the buildup. Okay?
Yeah.
Because Nick's going to say crazy stuff through the whole thing.
And apparently GSP's pretty fired up too.
Right. And we've never, the criticism on GSP out of the cage is that he is somewhat robotic, and I'm being kind. Okay,
right.
in saying that. So now, if he's really pissed, according to Dana, in the 7 years that he has known George, he said that George literally flipped out. Like, he's never seen him like that, and he went to him and begged him for that fight, and then they called Condit and so on. So it'll be interesting to see what a flipped out GSP looks like pre-fight and in the cage. And, of course, Nick is it's an adventure every time we interact with him.
Oh, man, that guy is hilarious. All right, this MMA30 segment is powered by The Gun Store. Next time you're in Las Vegas, if you want to shoot a real machine gun, do it at The Gun Store at 2900 East Tropicana.